On a damp August evening in 1851, deep within the tobacco fields of Southside, Virginia, a peculiar entry appeared in a slave trader's ledger, one that would never be fully explained. It read, "One specimen, approximately 19 years old, purchased from Charleston Market. Notable physical traits. Price, $28,470. The amount was nearly 4 times higher than the average market price. The buyer's name was recorded as Thomas Rutledge, proprietor of Belmont Estate. What followed over the next 14 months would leave behind 3 unexplained deaths, the abandonment of a once prosperous plantation, and the systematic destruction of nearly every document connected to that period. According to court records from Prince Edward County, the property was sold at auction in November 1852 for a fraction of its worth, with one unsettling clause. Several rooms were to remain permanently sealed. Local historians later uncovered 17 separate mentions of what came to be known as the Rutledge incident in private journals and letters of the time. Yet, all official documentation had been erased. The few surviving accounts describe an obsession so consuming it led to the collapse of everything it touched, an obsession that began with one enslaved person whose existence defied the conventions of the era. Before we continue the story of Belmont Estate and the mysterious purchase that would doom the Rutledge family, if you're drawn to the darker, forgotten pages of American history, the ones deliberately obscured, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear. Tap the subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss stories like this. Also, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Share your city or state in the comments below. Now, let's uncover what really transpired behind the closed doors of Belmont Estate, and why 3 people would give their lives to protect the secret. The truth of that autumn is more unsettling than any ghost story. In 1851, Southside Virginia was a world apart. A patchwork of sprawling plantations separated by dense oak and pine forests, connected by narrow dirt roads that turned into deep red mud during the rains. This was tobacco country, where wealth was measured in acres of land and the number of enslaved people one owned. The air itself felt heavy, thick with humidity and the bitter scent of curing tobacco leaves. Belmont Estate stood on the eastern edge of Prince Edward County, a 30,000-acre property that had belonged to the Rutledge family since 1783. The main house was a red brick Georgian mansion with white columns and black shutters. Elegant but reserved, it reflected a family proud of its heritage and reputation for refinement rather than excess. 42 enslaved individuals worked the plantation, living in 2 rows of cabins behind the main house, an entire village hidden in plain sight. That summer, Thomas Rutledge, then 37, managed the estate. He was tall, composed, and carried the refined features typical of Virginia's planter class. Having inherited Belmont 7 years earlier after his father's death, along with significant debts, he had since worked diligently to restore the estate's stability. By contemporary accounts, Rutledge was a strict but not unusually cruel master. He ran the property with methodical precision, in line with the standards of successful planters of his time. His wife, Catherine, 10 years his junior, was the daughter of a wealthy Richmond merchant who had made his fortune in shipping. Their marriage in 1847 brought a generous dowry that helped rescue the plantation from financial hardship. Catherine was admired for her beauty, slender, pale, with dark hair worn in the elaborate fashions of Virginia society. Yet, beneath that poise was a fragility that made others uneasy. She had given birth to a stillborn son in 1849, a loss that changed her deeply. Withdrawn and melancholic, she spent long hours reading in her upstairs sitting room, gazing out at the distant fields. The Rutledges led the life expected of their class, attending Christ Church in Farmville, hosting dinners for neighboring landowners, and maintaining the refined customs that defined Virginia's elite. Thomas served as a local magistrate and county board member, while Catherine managed charitable events and oversaw household affairs with quiet detachment. Outwardly, they embodied the image of stability and propriety. Yet beneath the surface, both were deeply dissatisfied in ways neither could express. Thomas carried a sense of emptiness that success could not satisfy. Catherine felt herself fading, unseen even in her own home. They lived parallel lives, together but distant. Into this quiet, stifling atmosphere arrived Samuel Wickham, a slave trader, on the morning of August 14, 1851. Wickham was well known across Southside Virginia, a lean man with sharp eyes and a threadbare black suit. He dealt in what he called specialty acquisitions, enslaved individuals with uncommon traits or skills that fetched higher prices among wealthy buyers. For months, Wickham had traveled the eastern seaboard, attending auctions from Baltimore to Savannah, searching for rare finds. Thomas received him in his office, a modest brick building separate from the main house, where he handled estate business. Wickham accepted a glass of whiskey, exchanged small talk about tobacco prices and the political climate, topics increasingly tense as debates over slavery and territory escalated. Then, leaning forward, Wickham lowered his voice. "I've come across something remarkable, Mr. Rutledge. Something I believe a man of your taste might appreciate." Thomas, uninterested, replied evenly, "I'm not looking to buy more field hands at present, Mr. Wickham." "This isn't a field hand," Wickham said, producing a folded document from his coat, a bill of sale marked with detailed notes. "This is a singular acquisition." The specimen had been bought 3 weeks earlier at the Charleston market. Its former owner, Dr. Albert Strad, was a physician who had obtained the enslaved individual from an estate sale in New Orleans. According to the records, the person had been raised in a household, received some education, and could both read and write, an uncommon skill for someone in bondage. Yet that wasn't what made this case extraordinary. Wickham paused, watching Thomas closely before continuing. "This slave is what medical men describe as a hermaphrodite, born with the physical traits of both male and female. It's a true medical rarity, something that occurs perhaps once in 1,000 births. Dr. Strad documented the condition before his death. The individual is healthy, young, around 19 or 20 years old. I'm authorized to sell this one, but only to the right buyer and for the right price." Thomas felt an unsettling pull within him. The idea of someone being both and neither stirred something he couldn't name. The slave, Wickham added, was trained from childhood to accept medical examinations. Complete obedience was ensured by Dr. Strad. It understands its unusual nature and does not resist inspection. He smiled faintly. "I'm asking $2,470, well above the going rate, but consider the rarity. This is a genuine phenomenon, valuable beyond any scientific curiosity." He let the silence linger. Thomas's mouth had gone dry. Thoughts of Catherine, sitting upstairs lost in her emptiness, drifted through his mind. "I'll need to see the slave first," he said quietly. "Of course," Wickham replied. "I have the wagon just outside." 20 minutes later, Thomas Rutledge stood in his office doorway, facing the enslaved person for the first time. The slave stood still, eyes lowered, hands clasped, the posture of submission ingrained from birth. The cotton shift revealed little, but even from across the room, Thomas could see what Wickham had meant, an unusual androgyny that defied easy definition. The face was striking yet unplaceable. Delicate cheekbones, full lips, and large, dark eyes framed by long lashes. The cropped black hair added to the ambiguity. The figure beneath the fabric hinted at both softness and strength, impossible to categorize. Graceful hands, narrow feet. Everything about this person seemed balanced between two worlds. Then came the voice. When Wickham instructed the slave to speak, the sound that emerged was neither distinctly male nor female, calm, clear, and unsettling in its neutrality. "My name is Jordan, master. I am 19 years old. I can read, write, and perform calculations. I have been trained to undergo medical examination without resistance. I am obedient and willing to serve." The words were mechanical, rehearsed, drained of emotion. Yet behind them, Thomas sensed awareness, intelligence, and a painful understanding of what was happening. Jordan knew exactly who they were and what was being sold. Thomas could not look away. Fascination and confusion tangled within him. "I'll take it," he heard himself say. The deal was concluded within the hour. Wickham accepted a bank draft, handed over the papers, and departed with the air of a man satisfied by an exceptional transaction. Thomas remained in the office, alone with his new purchase, uneasy yet intrigued. "Come with me," he said at last. "I need to decide where you'll stay." He did not send Jordan to the slave quarters behind the main house. Instead, he led them to a small cottage at the edge of the gardens, once occupied by his father's valet but unused for years. The cottage was isolated yet close enough for convenience. "You'll live here," Thomas instructed. "I'll call for you when I've determined your duties." Jordan stood motionless, hands clasped, expression blank. "Yes, master." Thomas returned to the main house, his mind restless. That evening at dinner, he mentioned the new acquisition to Catherine, speaking carefully. He described Jordan as a literate household slave with a refined background, possibly useful for domestic duties. Catherine barely looked up from her meal. "If you think it's necessary," she said. "The previous owner was a physician," Thomas continued. "He valued this one for medical reasons. The slave possesses uncommon physical traits. Someone like that might prove useful in the household." Something in his tone made Catherine pause. She studied him quietly. "What kind of traits?" Thomas hesitated. "It's difficult to explain. Perhaps you should see for yourself." The next morning, he brought Catherine to the cottage. She stood in the doorway, her expression detached at first, then gradually shifting as she took in Jordan's appearance. The quiet beauty, the unclassifiable presence, the tension of opposites. "This is Jordan," Thomas said evenly. "The one I mentioned." Catherine circled Jordan slowly, silent and observant. Jordan remained motionless, eyes lowered, breathing calm and steady. "What makes this one so different?" Catherine asked finally. Thomas explained the condition in precise, clinical language, avoiding emotion. As he spoke, he saw the same fascination awaken in her, the same unease mixed with curiosity that had gripped him. When he finished, Catherine stood still for several seconds before reaching out, her hand hovering near Jordan's face, then falling back. "May I examine them myself?" she asked softly. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "If you wish," he said. What followed in that cottage marked the beginning of their downfall. Catherine's inspection began with professional detachment, observing features, asking about Dr. Strahd's notes, but soon shifted into something neither could name. When they finally left, they spoke no word of it. That night, for the first time in months, they lay together again, not from affection, but from a shared, unspoken obsession with the person who now lived beyond their garden walls. It was the start of a fixation that would consume them both. By the autumn of 1851, as the tobacco harvest began and cooler air swept across Prince Edward County, something far more troubling had taken root inside Belmont Estate. Within a week of Jordan's arrival, new routines emerged. The enslaved people on the property noticed immediately, though few understood. Jordan was moved from the cottage to a third-floor room in the main house, officially as Catherine's personal maid. The slave received better clothing, finer meals, and lived apart from the others, existing in a strange state between privilege and captivity. But whispers spread. Workers saw the master and mistress vanish upstairs at odd times. They heard faint sounds behind closed doors. They saw Jordan move through the halls with blank eyes and careful steps. Harriet, the plantation cook and a woman who had served Belmont for over 20 years, was among the first to sense that something at the estate had gone deeply wrong. Harriet had served 3 generations of the Rutledge family and had developed sharp instincts that came from years of quiet observation. She began to notice unsettling changes around the estate. Thomas was neglecting the plantation, leaving unpaid bills scattered across his desk, and missing important meetings with neighboring landowners. Catherine, too, seemed to be fading away, eating less, growing thinner and paler, spending long hours locked inside that third-floor room. One late September morning, Harriet approached Jordan in the kitchen. The younger servant had come to prepare breakfast for the master and mistress, moving with a controlled, deliberate grace and an unreadable expression. "Child," Harriet said softly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "Are they hurting you up there? You can tell me. I've been here long enough to know when something isn't right." Jordan met her eyes with a calm, emotionless stare. "I have everything I need, Aunt Harriet." The master and mistress treat me well. That's not what I asked, Harriet replied gently. For a brief instant, something flickered across Jordan's face, perhaps pain or resignation, then disappeared behind that mask of composure. I do what I was born to do, Jordan said quietly. What I was trained to do. It's easier when you stop thinking about it. Before Harriet could respond, footsteps echoed from the stairs above. Jordan gathered the breakfast tray and slipped away, leaving Harriet standing in the kitchen with a growing sense of dread. That night, whispers spread through the slave quarters. People spoke in hushed tones about the strange new servant who never joined them for evening gatherings or secret prayers in the woods. Some of the elders murmured about old tales of conjure and hoodoo, of people born with peculiar gifts who could enchant their masters. Others dismissed it as superstition, though none could explain what was truly happening in the big house. Upstairs, in that dimly lit third-floor room, Thomas and Catherine had become consumed by their growing obsession. Thomas immersed himself in medical and anatomical texts, studying rare conditions and strange cases. He spent long hours comparing what he read to his observations of Jordan, keeping a secret journal filled with sketches and notes, far removed from the meticulous plantation ledgers he once maintained. He kept it locked away, hidden even from Catherine. Catherine's obsession took another form. She would spend entire afternoons with Jordan, instructing them to change clothes repeatedly, styling their hair in various ways, as though searching for meaning in appearance alone. She ordered new garments from a Farmville seamstress, some distinctly feminine, others masculine, designed to either highlight or conceal Jordan's androgynous form. I want to understand what you are, Catherine said one afternoon, adjusting a collar. Whether you're truly both, or neither, or something else entirely. Jordan's voice was calm but distant. Does it matter, mistress? I am what you see, what you choose to see. But tell me, what do you see when you look at yourself? For a fleeting moment, Jordan's emotion surfaced. I see what everyone has always seen, something to be studied, to be explained. Something that exists only to satisfy other people's curiosity. Catherine froze, her hands trembling. That's not. I didn't mean. But she couldn't finish because they both knew it was exactly what she meant. What both she and Thomas meant every time they summoned Jordan to that room. As September turned to October, the household appeared almost ordinary from the outside. Thomas still managed the plantation, though with a mechanical detachment. Catherine attended only the most necessary social events, declining most invitations. The enslaved workers carried on with their duties, whispering quietly among themselves, though none dared question their master's behavior. But signs of decay were visible. Thomas had grown gaunt, his clothes hanging loose on his frame, his eyes bright with sleepless intensity. Catherine's beauty had withered, her elegant gowns replaced by plain dark dresses, her hair neglected and dull, and Jordan remained unchanged, calm, obedient, moving like a ghost through the halls, existing in that uneasy space between person and property, between life and mere survival. Late in October, a crisis broke the uneasy stillness. Two field hands, brothers named Samuel and Isaac, attempted to flee. They were caught 15 miles away and brought back in chains. Thomas, shaken from his studies, was forced to respond as plantation custom demanded. The men were whipped, 10 lashes each, before the assembled workers. Thomas watched with empty eyes, his mind elsewhere. When the punishment ended and the others were dismissed, he stood alone by the whipping post, staring at it as if unsure what it meant anymore. Harriet watched from the kitchen window and finally understood. Her master was slipping away, consumed by something darker than obsession. That night, she heard raised voices from the third-floor room, muffled but unmistakable. It was the first time anger had pierced through their strange silence. The next morning, Jordan appeared in the kitchen again, moving slower than usual. When their eyes met, Harriet saw it clearly, the look of someone who already knew how everything would end, and had accepted it. November arrived with sharp winds that stripped the trees bare. The enslaved workers hurried to prepare for winter, but inside Belmont Estate, a deeper cold took hold, the chill of a household falling apart. The plantation's decline was becoming undeniable. Fields meant for winter wheat lay barren. Fences stood broken. Last season's tobacco still sat unsold in the barns because Thomas had neglected his contracts. Bills piled higher on his desk, unopened. Neighbors began to talk. They noted Thomas's absence from church and his failure to attend county meetings. Some blamed grief, others suspected money troubles or drink. No one imagined the truth. It was far stranger than anything they could comprehend. Catherine withdrew entirely. She no longer pretended to manage the house or socialize. When she did step outside, she moved like someone half asleep. Friends stopped calling, their visits politely turned away. Even the minister who came to check on her health left unsettled and did not return. The enslaved community sensed the depth of the disorder. The barrier between master and servant had eroded in ways that made everyone uneasy. Thomas stopped giving clear orders, and Catherine ceased overseeing the household. The plantation now ran only on the will of those who worked it, people who understood that their survival depended on maintaining the rhythm of life, even as their masters unraveled before their eyes. And then there was Jordan. At first, the other enslaved people regarded Jordan with suspicion mixed with unease. This newcomer, brought from elsewhere, lived in the big house and seemed to hold some inexplicable power over the master and mistress. But as weeks turned into months, their suspicion turned into pity. They saw that Jordan lived in a kind of confinement, separate from everyone else, trapped in a role that none could fully understand but all sensed was deeply wrong. Some tried to reach out. Delia, who had once been Catherine's maid before Jordan's arrival, approached one afternoon when they passed each other in the hall. "If you ever need anything," Delia said quietly, "someone to talk to, or anything at all, just know you're not alone here." Jordan looked at her with that same guarded expression. "Thank you, but I am alone. We all are, in the end." The words were calm, not self-pitying, just matter-of-fact. Delia watched Jordan walk away, feeling a sorrow that came not from her own hardship, but from recognizing suffering she couldn't help. By late November, Thomas had begun withdrawing, even from Jordan. His nightly visits to the third-floor room became rare. Instead, he spent long hours in his study, drinking whiskey and staring at his locked journal, as though waiting for answers that would never come. Catherine, meanwhile, filled the void. She spent nearly all her time in Jordan's room, barely eating or sleeping, consumed by the obsession that had overtaken everything else in her life. She would talk endlessly about her childhood in Richmond, her marriage, and the baby she lost. She spoke of her belief that she had failed at the very essence of being a woman. Jordan listened quietly, responding when expected, offering no comfort or judgment. At times, Catherine would fall asleep in the chair by the window. Jordan would gently place a blanket over her and sit still until she woke hours later, confused about her surroundings. "Why do you stay?" Catherine asked one day. "You could run. Samuel and Isaac tried. You're clever, you might succeed." "And go where, mistress?" Jordan replied softly. "I was born marked as different. Wherever I go, people see it. They want to understand it, to control it, to own it. Here, at least, I know what to expect." "That's awful," Catherine whispered. "Yes, mistress. It is." During one of these long afternoons, Catherine finally gave voice to the question that had haunted her for months. "Do you hate us, Thomas and me?" Jordan paused for a long moment before answering, weighing every word. "Hate requires a kind of freedom I don't have, mistress. To hate you, I'd have to believe I deserve something else, to believe I have the right to be treated as fully human. But I was taught that I don't have that right, that my difference makes me less than human, something to be studied, displayed. So no, I don't hate you. I endure you, just as I have endured everyone before, and everyone who will come after." Catherine began to cry, deep, uncontrollable sobs that seemed to come from the core of her being. Jordan sat still, offering no comfort, simply observing her collapse with quiet neutrality. When Catherine finally composed herself, her face was blotched and her eyes swollen. "I think we're destroying ourselves," she said. "Thomas and I, this fixation with you, it's eating us alive." "Yes, mistress. And you're just watching it happen? What else can I do? Catherine had no answer. The long brewing crisis finally reached its peak on December 15th, when Dr. Edmund Carroll arrived at Belmont Estate. A physician from Richmond and an old friend of Thomas's father, he had written weeks earlier offering sympathy after hearing rumors of Thomas's business troubles. In his desperation to validate his obsession, Thomas had replied, mentioning his acquisition of a rare medical curiosity and inviting Carroll to visit. The doctor arrived that afternoon, a stout man in his 60s with white sideburns and the assured manner of someone long accustomed to deference. Thomas greeted him with forced enthusiasm. Catherine remained upstairs, claiming illness. That evening, they dined together and Thomas, barely able to contain himself, spoke about Jordan. At first, his tone was clinical, discussing anatomy and the rarity of true hermaphroditism. But soon he grew animated, his fascination spilling through his words. Carroll listened politely, his professional curiosity slowly giving way to discomfort. "I'd be very interested to examine this person," Carroll said at last. "If you're agreeable." "Of course," Thomas replied. "That's why I asked you here, to give your expert opinion." Something in his tone made Carroll uneasy. After dinner, Thomas led him to Jordan's room. Catherine sat by the window, pale and withdrawn in her dark dress. Jordan stood by the door, hands clasped, expression neutral. "This is Jordan," Thomas said formally. "The slave I wrote you about." Carroll approached with clinical professionalism, asking questions about age, health, and background. Jordan responded with quiet precision, neither emotional nor mechanical. "May I perform a brief physical examination?" Carroll asked. "Nothing invasive, just observation." Thomas nodded. "Of course, doctor. Jordan is used to examination." What followed was unlike anything that had taken place in that room before, a respectful, methodical medical assessment. Carroll observed, made brief notes, and treated Jordan as a patient, not an object. When finished, his expression was thoughtful, touched with concern. "Remarkable," he murmured. "A genuine case of hermaphroditism, extraordinarily rare." He looked at both Thomas and Catherine. "Might I speak with you privately, Mr. Rutledge?" They went to Thomas's study. Carroll accepted a brandy, speaking carefully. "Thomas, I've known your family many years. I respected your father, which is why I must be frank. That person upstairs does indeed have a rare condition. But what worries me isn't the slave's anatomy. It's what I saw in that room. The way you and your wife look at that person. The intensity, the obsession." Thomas's face darkened. "I don't know what you're implying. I'm saying you've become dangerously attached, to the point that it's consuming you. Your plantation is failing, your wife is wasting away, and you yourself—" He hesitated. "You look consumed. This must stop before it destroys you." "Jordan is my property," Thomas said sharply. "How I manage my property is my concern." "There are moral boundaries, Thomas. Even in slavery," Carroll said firmly. "And I fear you've crossed them." The conversation devolved into argument. Thomas grew defensive and angry. Carroll remained composed but resolute, warning him of the path he was on. Thomas refused to listen. The next morning, Carroll departed, deeply troubled, convinced that something terrible was unraveling at Belmont. He considered writing to others, even the authorities, but what could he report? That a man was unnaturally fixated on a slave? It was neither illegal nor uncommon. So he did nothing, and the chance to intervene slipped away. Afterward, Thomas and Catherine avoided mentioning the visit, but both were changed. Carroll's words had forced them to acknowledge, however briefly, the truth of their dissent. Instead of pulling them back, that realization drove them deeper, into denial, into desperation, into self-destruction. January 1852 brought heavy snow that cut Belmont off for nearly 3 weeks. The fields lay buried, the enslaved huddled around fires for warmth, and inside the house, Thomas and Catherine sank further into darkness. With no society to face, no appearances to maintain, they gave up all restraint. Thomas stopped managing the estate. Catherine never left the 3rd floor. And Jordan endured, existing between life and survival, between human and object. Yet something in Jordan had shifted. The slave began to speak more often, not in defiance, but in calm, unsettling truth that made both master and mistress uneasy. "You're hurting each other now, not just me," Jordan said one evening after Catherine fled in tears. "This is consuming you both." Thomas, exhausted, glared at Jordan. "What do you want? An apology? Your property. You exist to serve. Is that what you believe, master?" Jordan replied, "Because from where I stand, I seem to be the only free one here. You and the mistress are chained to your desires, slaves to something you can never possess. I submit because I must. You submit because you can't help it." The words cut deeper than any blow. Thomas raised a hand to strike but lowered it again. What punishment could restore the control he had lost? None. He turned and left without a word. February brought a thaw, but not peace. In the quarters, whispers grew darker and more fearful. Some began planning escape, certain that something dreadful was about to happen, and wanting to be far away when it did. Thomas no longer went to the third floor, leaving Catherine to bring her own meals or go hungry. 2 more field hands attempted to escape and were captured, but Thomas barely reacted. The overseer carried out their punishment without consulting him, increasingly managing the plantation's daily work while the master sank deeper into his fixation. Catherine's decline had become impossible to ignore. She ate almost nothing, slept only in restless fragments, and spent every waking moment either in Jordan's room or wandering the halls like a restless spirit. Her absence worried her friends from the charitable societies, who sent unanswered letters. When the minister came again, the servants turned him away. "I see myself in you," Catherine whispered to Jordan one afternoon. "Neither one thing nor another. Neither alive nor dead, trapped between both." "No, mistress," Jordan replied softly. "You see what you want to see. I'm only a person, born different, yes, but still just a person. It's you and the master who made me into something else, a reflection of your confusion, your own sense of being lost." Catherine's hands trembled as she hugged herself. "But you're lost too." "We're all lost, perhaps," Jordan answered calmly. "But I was lost long before I came to Belmont Estate. You chose this. That's the difference." The servants soon noticed how drastically the mistress had changed. One morning, Dalia passed her in the hall and stopped, startled. Catherine had become skeletal, her eyes hollow and wild, her hair hanging loose and unkempt. She moved like someone half dead, drifting through the house without direction or purpose. Thomas was no better. He no longer shaved or changed clothes regularly. He wandered the halls at strange hours, muttering to himself, sometimes standing outside Jordan's door for long minutes without knocking. The servants learned to stay out of sight. His moods had grown unpredictable, and it seemed any small disturbance might cause him to break completely. In the quarters, whispers turned from uncertainty to conviction. Something dreadful was coming. Everyone could feel it, that tense stillness that settles before a storm. They began to prepare quietly, hiding bits of food, repairing shoes, and discussing which direction offered the best chance to reach freedom. Finally, Harriet decided to intervene, certain that if no one acted, blood would be shed. She found Thomas in his study late one afternoon, staring blankly ahead, a glass of whiskey forgotten in his hand. Standing in the doorway, she gathered her courage, knowing the risk she was taking. "Master Rutledge," she said softly, "I need to speak plain with you." He looked up slowly, as if returning from a distant place. "What is it, Harriet?" "This thing between you, the mistress, and that slave Jordan. It isn't right, sir. It's killing all 3 of you. I see it every day. You have to let that child go. Sell Jordan. Send them somewhere far away before this house tears itself apart." Thomas stared at her for a long time. Harriet braced for anger or punishment, for the violence masters often unleashed when confronted. But instead, something in his face collapsed. For a moment, the truth showed plainly. He knew she was right but couldn't change it. "Get out, Harriet," he said at last, his voice barely audible. Just get out. She left with her heart pounding, knowing she had tried and failed. If the story chills you, share it with a friend who enjoys dark mysteries. Press the like button to support our work, and don't forget to subscribe, because the terror at Belmont Estate is nearing its final, dreadful end. The breaking point came on February 14th, 1852. The day began like any other in that decaying household. Thomas rose late, unshaven and hollow-eyed. Catherine hadn't left the third floor in 3 days. Jordan went about quiet routines of survival, fetching water, performing the small tasks that maintained an illusion of order. But something was different. Those who knew Catherine well, especially the enslaved women who had long served her, sensed she had reached a breaking point. That morning she seemed strangely calm, her usual nervous energy replaced by an eerie stillness. Delia noticed it when she saw the mistress in the hall. Catherine's eyes were glassy, distant, as if focused on something far away. Her movements were deliberate, ritual-like. When Delia offered tea, Catherine simply shook her head and continued upstairs in silence. Harriet saw it too, and a wave of dread gripped her. As she worked in the kitchen, she whispered prayers that whatever was coming would pass swiftly and spare the innocent. By evening, cold rain had begun to fall, drumming against the windows and turning the landscape into shifting gray shadows. The wind howled around the house, making it groan as if under great weight. It felt like a night when terrible things could happen, when the world itself seemed to pause its order. Thomas sat in his study, staring at the fire and drinking with mechanical regularity. He no longer tried to make sense of his life or his failures. He existed in a haze of liquor and exhaustion, waiting for something nameless to arrive. Upstairs, Catherine sat in Jordan's room, watching the slave with a familiar yet newly desperate intensity. The oil lamp flickered, casting long, restless shadows on the walls. Outside, the storm deepened, thunder echoing in the distance. "I can't do this anymore," she said suddenly, her voice cracking. "I can't wake up another day in this house, living this life, knowing what we've become." Jordan, sitting on the narrow bed, met her gaze steadily. "Then leave, mistress. Take what money you can and go far away. Start again." Catherine laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "How can I start over when I carry all this inside me? Every time I close my eyes, I see what we've done. There's no starting over. There's only ending it." The tone in her voice made Jordan tense. "Mistress, what do you mean?" Catherine began pacing to the window and back, movements sharp and restless. Lightning illuminated her face, pale, haunted, already half dead. "I thought understanding would free me," she said. "If I could uncover your mystery, maybe I'd solve my own emptiness. But it only made things worse. You were right, Jordan. You're just a person. We made you into a mirror for our brokenness. And I can't live with that anymore." "Catherine," Jordan said, using her name for the first time. "Whatever you're thinking, please stop. Talk to someone. The minister, a doctor, someone who can help." "Help me what?" Catherine cried. "Pretend we're good people? We're not. We used another human being to fill the emptiness inside us. And it didn't work. Now I'm hollow all the way through." She moved to the dresser, opened a drawer, and drew out something that caught the lamplight. A pistol, one of Thomas's father's dueling guns. Jordan rose slowly, hands raised in calm. "Please put it down." "Why?" Catherine asked, voice trembling. "So we can keep living like this? I'm tired, Jordan. Tired of being alive. Tired of feeling everything and nothing." Thunder crashed above, shaking the house. The lamp flickered, nearly going out before steadying again. In that dim light, Catherine's face looked skeletal, her eyes empty. The door burst open. Thomas stood there, soaked from rain, eyes fixed on the pistol. The fog of drink and despair vanished in an instant. "Catherine, what are you doing?" She turned toward him, tears streaking her face. "I'm ending it, Thomas, before we destroy anyone else." "Give me the gun," he said, stepping forward carefully. "Please, we can what?" she interrupted, laughing bitterly. "Fix this? There's no fixing it. We ruin this person. She gestured toward Jordan. And each other. Everything we touched turned to rot. Jordan spoke quietly, steady despite the weapon aimed their way. You're not monsters, Catherine. You made terrible choices, yes, but you can still choose differently. You can still walk away. It's too late, she said. It's been too late since the day Thomas brought you here. Maybe even before that, when I married for money, when I lost the baby, when I realized I'd never be who I was supposed to be. Every breath hurts. I see what we are, and I can't bear it anymore. Thomas reached toward her. Please think about what you're doing. I have, she screamed. For weeks. This is the only choice left that's mine. Her face softened suddenly, a strange peace overtaking her expression. The trembling stopped. I'm sorry, she whispered to Jordan. For all of it, for what we did. For turning you into what we couldn't face in ourselves. Then, moving slowly, she turned the pistol toward herself and pressed it beneath her chin. No! Thomas lunged forward, but too late. The gunshot exploded through the room, the sound swallowing everything. Catherine fell backward, the floorboards darkening as blood spread beneath her head in a glistening pool. Thomas dropped to his knees, emitting raw, wordless sounds of grief. His hands hovered over her body, wanting to touch but terrified to cause more harm. Jordan stood by the window, motionless, their expression unreadable. Perhaps pity, perhaps relief, perhaps nothing at all. Outside, the storm continued. Downstairs, the servants froze. Harriet stood in the kitchen, prayers unanswered. Delia covered her mouth to muffle a scream. The others whispered urgently, unsure whether to run or stay, uncertain if this was an ending or the beginning of something worse. Catherine lived for 17 more hours. The bullet had caused terrible damage but did not kill her instantly. She drifted between life and death, beyond pain or awareness. Thomas sat beside her, holding her hand, whispering apologies she could not hear. Jordan brought water and clean cloths, tending silently to both master and dying mistress, neither comforting nor condemning, simply performing necessary tasks. The doctor arrived near midnight. After examining Catherine, he shook his head gravely. The wound was too deep. Survival was impossible. When Thomas asked if she suffered, the doctor assured him she felt nothing, already beyond pain or thought. Thomas dismissed him and stayed by her side through the long, dark hours, murmuring confessions of love, guilt, and despair. Truths he had never voiced while she lived. He spoke of the emptiness within him, of believing she could fill it, only to find she was just as broken as he was. He told her he was sorry. Thomas spent the night beside Catherine's body, whispering apologies. Sorry for bringing Jordan into their lives. Sorry for setting events in motion that could only end in ruin. Most of the time, he sat in silence, watching her breathing slow and weaken as the hours passed. By dawn, gray light crept through the windows, matching the cold rain outside. Catherine's breathing shifted again, harsh and uneven, the final sound of a body surrendering life. Thomas leaned close, tears falling on her pale cheeks, gripping her hand with desperate strength. I'm sorry, he whispered for the last time. For everything, for failing you, for all of it. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused, perhaps seeing him, perhaps nothing. Her lips moved as if to form words, but no sound came. Whatever she tried to say vanished unheard. Then she was gone. Her final breath faded. Her hand grew still in his grasp. The faint warmth of her skin turned to the chill that comes for all the dead. Thomas remained with her for hours, motionless, thoughtless, overwhelmed by a vast emptiness that seemed to consume everything. Not just Catherine, not just himself, but the entire world around him collapsed into a hollow void without end. At last, Jordan spoke from the doorway, voice calm and even. Master, we need to call for help. The servants, the doctor. Someone should be told. Thomas lifted his head slowly. His face was hollowed by grief and sleeplessness, his eyes raw from crying, his hands still clutching his wife's cold fingers. Then, unable to bear the truth of his own guilt, he turned on the only person left. "This is your fault," he said, voice flat and lifeless. "You did this. You destroyed everything." Jordan met his gaze without flinching or anger. "No, master," they said quietly. "You did this to yourselves. I was only here." The words hung in the still air, simple, undeniable, final. Thomas had no reply. He turned back toward Catherine's body and said nothing more. The aftermath unfolded predictably, each step following the last with grim logic. Thomas claimed Catherine's death had been an accident, a tragic mistake while she was handling one of his father's old pistols, unaware it was loaded. The local magistrate, an old friend of Thomas's who understood the shame and legal difficulties of suicide for a respectable family, accepted the story without question. He conducted a brief, shallow inquiry, avoiding anything that might complicate matters. In 1852 Virginia, suicide meant disgrace, legal trouble, and issues with inheritance and the church. An accident was cleaner, simpler for everyone. 3 days later, Catherine was buried at Christ Church in Farmville. The funeral drew many local planters and their wives, who came to offer condolences in the cold rain. They spoke softly of the tragedy, remarking on how much Thomas had aged, how sorrow had hollowed him out. They expressed genuine sympathy, unaware of the truth. These were people who had known the Rutledges for generations but had no idea what had truly happened behind the closed doors of Belmont Estate. If any suspected, they kept silent. In Virginia society, certain questions were never asked, and certain truths were too dangerous to admit. But among the enslaved, the truth traveled quickly. In the quarters of Belmont and neighboring plantations, the story spread through quiet conversations after dark, part warning, part legend. The tale changed with each retelling, becoming almost mythic, a story of how power and desire destroyed the masters themselves. It spoke of Jordan, the strange slave, neither man nor woman, whose mere presence brought ruin to the Rutledges. Some said Jordan possessed supernatural influence, a charm or spell that drove masters to madness. Others believed Jordan's beauty was so striking that even decent people lost control. Still others claimed Jordan had done nothing, only reflected the corruption already inside the Rutledges, who destroyed themselves when faced with their own reflection. The truth, as always, was less sensational, ordinary and complex, but the legend served its purpose. It reminded the enslaved that their masters were not untouchable, that guilt and obsession could consume even the powerful, and that sometimes survival itself was victory. Within a week of the funeral, Thomas decided to sell Belmont Estate. He met with buyers, accepted the first reasonable offer, far below the property's worth, just to escape the place and its memories. Before the sale was completed, he did 3 deliberate things. First, he ordered the third-floor room where Catherine had died to be permanently sealed. Workers cleared the furniture and scrubbed the bloodstains, though no amount of cleaning could erase them completely. He locked the door and threw the key into the well, adding a clause in the sale agreement that the room must remain closed forever. The buyer, a Petersburg merchant, agreed without hesitation. One locked room in a 20-room house was no concern to him. Second, Thomas destroyed every document connected to Jordan, bills of sale, medical reports, letters from Dr. Carroll, and even personal notes. He fed each piece into the fire, watching years of paper turn to ash. He burned Catherine's diary too, unread, unwilling to face her view of what had happened. Third, he sold most of the enslaved workers along with the estate, scattering families and communities across the county once again. He felt distant guilt for the suffering he caused but did nothing to change it. He needed money to rebuild, and human lives were still considered property. Yet he kept Jordan. When asked why, he had no clear answer. Perhaps it was because Jordan was the only one who understood the full truth, the only witness to his downfall. Perhaps some trace of his old fascination lingered. Or maybe he simply couldn't imagine anyone else owning Jordan, or hurting them as he once had. Thomas moved to a modest home in Lynchburg with just 3 enslaved servants, Jordan and 2 elderly workers too old to sell for much. The house was quiet, ordinary, and far smaller than Belmont. Thomas lived there quietly, withdrawn, carrying the weight of what had been lost. His estate, his wife, and the last fragments of his own peace. Thomas had become a recluse, leaving his home only when absolutely necessary and refusing all social invitations. Once a central figure in Virginia's planter society, he had now withdrawn completely from that world. Neighbors occasionally caught sight of him walking alone in the early mornings, his steps slow and unsteady, his back bent under an invisible burden. He spoke to no one, made no friends, and took no part in the community. He lived without direction or joy, merely existing from one day to the next. Jordan occupied a small upstairs room in the same house, which was still legally Thomas's property, though no longer kept with the obsessive care once seen at Belmont. The two rarely exchanged words. When they did, it was only out of necessity and marked by polite formality. Thomas giving brief instructions, and Jordan following them quietly and efficiently. The intense, painful closeness that had once bound them was gone, replaced by an unbridgeable silence. Legally, they were master and slave, yet in truth, they lived like two shadows sharing the same space. Bound by memories neither could escape and both longed to forget. At times, during sleepless nights, Thomas would stand outside Jordan's door, his hand raised as if to knock. He seemed to long for something, perhaps understanding, perhaps forgiveness, perhaps just the confirmation that what had happened between them had held meaning beyond pain and exploitation. But he never followed through. After a long pause, he would lower his trembling hand and walk back to his own room in silence. Jordan, lying awake, always knew he was there. He could hear the faint sound of Thomas's breathing, sense his presence on the other side of the door. Yet he never opened it, never spoke, never offered comfort or confrontation. There was nothing left to say, nothing that could undo or transform what had already been done. Time moved slowly in that quiet, haunted house. Thomas aged visibly. His hair turned gray, his face hollowed, his eyes dulled with emptiness. He drank, though rarely to excess, just enough to dull the edges of his memories and allow sleep to come on nights when guilt threatened to consume him. On the morning of November 3, 1852, 9 months after Catherine's death, Thomas Rutledge was found dead in his bed. The physician who examined him found no cause, no illness, no wound, no poison. His heart had simply stopped. The doctor noted with detached observation that sometimes, a man can die of a broken spirit as surely as from a broken bone. When the will to live departs, the body often follows soon after. Jordan was later sold at auction, along with the rest of Thomas's modest estate, the house, furniture, and 2 elderly servants. He was purchased for $412, a small fraction of his earlier value, as rumors of his unusual nature had spread through the community. The buyer, a farmer from Appomattox County, ignored the gossip and needed only a household servant. After that, Jordan disappeared from the historical record. There are no further documents, no sales papers, estate records, or legal mentions of any kind. Like countless others enslaved in America, Jordan vanished into the darkness of history. His fate unrecorded, his suffering remembered only in whispers. Perhaps he eventually escaped to freedom through flight north, through the chaos of the Civil War, or through emancipation itself. Maybe he found a place where no one knew of Belmont, where difference no longer marked him as strange but merely human. Perhaps he found peace, healing from the cruelty he endured under Thomas and Catherine Rutledge. Or perhaps not. Perhaps his life ended in hardship, passed from one master to another, used and forgotten, buried in an unmarked grave. History is filled with such stories. Lives without redemption or recognition, suffering without justice or remembrance. Still, we want to believe that Jordan survived, that somehow, against all odds, he found a way to live beyond the shadow of what had been done to him. Belmont Estate remained abandoned for 3 years before being purchased by a merchant from Petersburg, the same man who had acquired it from Thomas. The new owner, intent on reviving the property's former success, moved in with his family. Yet within weeks, unsettling rumors began to circulate. The sealed room on the 3rd floor made everyone uneasy. A persistent chill lingered near its door, even during the hottest summer days, and faint sounds were sometimes heard from within, though the room had been locked and unused for years. Despite the conditions of the sale, which required that the room remain sealed, curiosity eventually overcame the new owner's hesitation. He ordered it opened. Inside, workers discovered disturbing traces of the past. Dark stains on the floor that resisted cleaning, marks on the walls showing where furniture once stood, and an oppressive atmosphere that made even the strongest men refuse to remain inside for long. The owner ordered the room completely cleared, replacing the floorboards and repainting the walls. Still, his family could not escape the feeling that something tragic had occurred there, an enduring presence of sorrow and violence that lingered despite every attempt to erase it. Over the next 10 years, Belmont changed owners 4 more times. Each buyer stayed only briefly before selling the property at a loss. Rumors persisted. Strange noises at night, shadows that seemed to move on their own, and an unshakable sense of dread in certain rooms. Each new owner dismissed the stories as local superstition, until they, too, sold the house and quietly cautioned the next buyer that something about the place felt deeply wrong. By 1865, during the closing months of the Civil War, the main house was destroyed by fire under circumstances that were never fully explained. Some believed Union soldiers set it ablaze while passing through. Others thought local residents, weary of the mansion's dark reputation, had burned it deliberately. And still others whispered that the house had consumed itself, that the weight of its past had become unbearable, and the fire had begun from within. Only the foundation and a few outbuildings survived. Over the following decades, they decayed slowly until the surrounding forest reclaimed them. Today, almost nothing remains of Belmont Estate, just fragments of old brick foundations hidden beneath layers of leaves and vines. The property is privately owned and marked with well-kept, no trespassing signs, though no one seems to know who maintains them or why. Local historians acknowledge that a plantation once stood there and that the Rutledge family lived and died on the land. Yet records about the estate are strangely incomplete. It appears that long ago, someone deliberately removed much of its history from public archives, including the sealed court documents connected to what became known as the Rutledge Incident.